noches a todos. Good evening, everybody. Hello, buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Mejor, buenas noches. It's Friday. Yeah, okay.
Y el cuerpo lo sabe.
Bueno, muy bien. This is such an honor. I'm so happy to see each and every one of you here today. My heart is so full of joy to have an amazing speaker and a real queen in our field to honor us with her presence. We are, yes, and we'll get to that. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. So just to honor those who have come before us, I'd like to take a moment to honor the land beneath us. The land that North Carolina State University sits on is land that was originally stewarded by two indigenous tribes, the Tuscarora and the Catawba tribes. We honor these tribes today by recognizing that this institution of higher education is built on land stolen from those who were here before colonizers arrived. Additionally, this land has borne witness to over 400 years of enslavement, torture, and systematic mistreatment of African people and their descendants. We honor these people today by recognizing them in order to break the cycle of colonization and the continued erasure of indigenous and Black peoples. We must acknowledge the history of the spaces and places we occupy to both understand and unlearn the many ways that we have been socialized. It's also Yom Kippur, so I want to wish our Jewish friends a meaningful fast today. My name is Maria Cody, and I'm the Goodnight Distinguished Professor in Educational Equity and a Professor of Multilingual Education at North Carolina State University. This is our third year here doing the Linguistic Diversity Speaker Series, and it's an honor to have this space and share it with you. Just a little bit of logistics before we get started. We, just out here to my left, there are restrooms around the corner, and also, as you know, we'll have a reception in the entranceway just after the talk today, okay? This is a multilingual event, so I definitely encourage you to use your languages as representations of your identities and your strengths. Refreshments will be out in the main area after the talk, and I hope you get a chance to meet new people and connect with our network of multilinguals here at North Carolina State. Before we begin, there are some very important thank yous and recognitions I'd like to make today. And of course, this would not be possible without the esteemed Dr. Ofelia García. So thank you for your kindness, love, and contribution. Thank you. The first, I'd really like to recognize the Carolina Association for Bilingual Education.
Yes.
Woo-hoo. If you are a board member or on the planning committee, could you please stand up here? Okay. Woo, okay. Muy bien. Thank you. These are your visionaries and educational leaders and equity warriors. So contact them, be in touch. They are leading an organization and a movement. And as Dr. Machado has taught us, they are intellectual. It's an intellectual movement here at NC State, and we are grateful for all of your work. I'd like to also thank our NC State staff and Wolf Bites, our technology crew in the back, and some phenomenal PhD students. Rocio Lopez Caicedo is here. Zaina Dali from Morocco, Alejandro Amaya, Jody Robertson, Heisha Carrillo, Amelia Rivera, who's here always to help, and a tremendous thank you especially to Cassie Rubenstein, without whose work we could not pull this off for sure. They have worked really hard for 2 years on these events, and I really thank you very much. And I know it takes a team and a community to transform education, so muchísimas gracias. I also want to give a very special thank you to Dr. Margarita Machado Casas, who is not only a leader in the world in her work in Afro-Indigenous language and bilingual education, but my colleague on the National Board of the National Association for Bilingual Education, and all of her work. You have to hear her speak tomorrow. Tomorrow we have a half-day event, and she will be telling us her story that is so powerful, and we thank you for all that you do. Es un placer. Okay, so lots of thank yous, and I hope I haven't overlooked anyone. And so now I'd like to introduce to you Sylvia McDonald, who is going to give the welcome for our speaker. Sylvia works for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and I had the pleasure of reading her biography and meeting her. She was born and raised in Costa Rica and identifies herself as a true tica. Muy bien,
Pura
tica.
vida.
Pura vida. Muy bien. Her passion for education took root early in life, teaching Spanish in Alaska, where she experienced firsthand the challenges and rewards of a language learning environment. Eventually, she relocated, fast forward, to North Carolina and worked as a pre-K and kindergarten teacher assistant, and had 14-year tenure at Cumberland County Schools, where she taught multilingual learners across all grade levels. During that time, she contributed to DLI, summer camps in Chinese and Spanish, fostering language development for a diverse group of students. Holding a degree in curriculum and instruction and administration, she subsequently transitioned to work in DLI in Moore County, overseeing DLI and ML programs. She is driven by a deep desire to deepen her expertise. She pursued a master's in curriculum and instruction and administrator certification. She is now the Title III consultant with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and in her words, quote, remains deeply committed to supporting multilingual learners, their families, and the dedicated educators who serve them. So please help me welcome Sylvia for giving a welcome.
Thank you so much, and I am just so proud to be here. I'm typically not a nervous speaker, and you know that. Some of you saw me at the conference where I just came into the stage and did my thing without a problem. But I feel very different about this meeting today, because I seriously recognize where I'm standing and the people who I'm standing in front of. So I feel not only I feel a responsibility, but I feel honored. But I'm also here, I'm actually here on behalf of the NCDPI. I was just gonna start talking about me. Remember, that's not what I was saying to do, okay? So I wanna say that I'm here on behalf of NCDPI, and I also feel very responsible standing here. I was telling people, as you greeted me, that I started working with ESL many years ago. I started very young, believe me. So many years ago, and Ivana happened to be one of I would go to conferences and I would say, when I grow up, I want to be with Ivana. I want to be like Ivana. And I don't know what I have done to deserve, but now I get to work side by side. So from the DPI multilingual team, back to my notes, that's what I wrote in. I just want to extend a thank you for having us here. And while I have your attention, I just want to bring your attention to the fact that this year, ML Title III is working really hard to promote a collaborative approach, because we feel that we're no longer, I don't know if you know, but we're no longer 20th century. I don't know if you got the news, but I don't know if you have noticed that in our schools, we're still functioning that way. Well, we need to move away from that. And funny enough, as I'm looking at the biography for Dr. Garcia, I'm seeing the 21st century book, and I am like, oh my gosh, we need to do that. So MCDPI is working really, really hard to help, to guide, to talk to school districts about, okay, bilingualism is the norm, and we need to open up to it. And how are we going to do it? How are we going to collaborate? How are we going to work? So with that approach in mind, we have been working really, really, really hard on educating administrators, like I had today the privilege to be speaking in front of a superintendent. I didn't know there was a superintendent until he identified himself, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we need to change the system, and the superintendent's in there going like, yes. So that's a really, really good thing. Then again, we want to continue equipping all of educators with the tools that they need to support our learners, because it's all about them. It's all about them. It's what we care about. So with that said, I want to say that we could not have done any of that if it wasn't for the pioneers, the people that came and broke away, the people who said we need to move away, and they have been voicing this need to move away from that 20th century mentality, and we need to settle ourselves into what is today. We're a multicultural nation, and we need to change that. And within those pioneers, we know that we have Dr. Ofelia García. As I was practicing for this, I was trying to say Ofelia. And then I said, that's totally gonna defer the purpose of this presentation. And I am so thankful I can call her Ofelia. It just makes my heart so happy that it doesn't matter. Because to me, she's Ofelia, and to some of you, she is Ofelia. And it's okay. So with that, I was told that she doesn't want a lengthy introduction about all her degrees and all her accolades, but I want to say this. Dr. Garcia, I want to thank you for being that pioneer for the little Sylvias, little old, but I still feel little, who stood right there thinking that they could do it. Because it was your work and the work that you have done that today is opening a way for Sylvia to stand right here and to find a value and to say words of encouragement. I know that you have been celebrated for your groundbreaking work on translanguaging. Little did I know that when I was doing all those graduate school paperworks, I was quoting her. And now I get to meet her here. Isn't that amazing? Yes, dreams come through. Because America happens to be the land of dreams. I am here dreaming the same, talking to the same people that I dreamed and that I quoted on my papers, and I got really good grades on those papers. I read in here that Dr. Garcia's work has reshaped how educators and policymakers understand multilingualism. And that's one of my dreams. That's one of my goals. So when I hear that somebody has done it, I believe that we can do it too. So if you're here today and you are still a little bit doubtful, but you have a voice, remember her work. Remember that it can be done here in North Carolina. Yes. We can do it together. Mm-hmm. So without any, because I also practice the word repertoire in English. Because I said, I'm just going to say a lot of the repertoire because she's going to be saying it all over. And I said, you know what? I'm just not going to say it in front of people because they can laugh at me. So I'm going to stop there before I have to say something about the linguistic repertorios. And I'm just going to say, thank you. Thank you for your work. And I want to say to the rest of you who are like the real cool people who are doing such amazing things, thank you. I always say this in my presentations on behalf of the multilingual learners of North Carolina. Thank you for taking time on a Friday afternoon to come here. You really do care about them. And thank you for caring about our multilingual learners and the teachers who teach them. Yeah.
Gracias, Silvia. ¿Me puedes abrir aquí?
Y eso, this is the clicker.
Okay, gracias. Gracias, Silvia, y gracias, María, por esta invitación. It's a real privilege for me to be here in North Carolina. Just a little bit about me. I was born in Cuba, but I arrived in New York City when I was almost 11, and I have not left it. So North Carolina is a very different place, and I come because, not because I have anything to teach you, but because you have a lot to teach me about your rural context and your politics and your policies. So, muchas gracias por la invitación y gracias por prestar atención y venir hoy, viernes por la noche casi, a oír un ratito lo que vamos a hacer. Yo quiero empezar por hacerme la pregunta de why am I talking about bilingual learners and not multilingual learners? I know that in North Carolina you use multilingual learners. In New York City also we use multilingual learners. New York State actually, but you know, of course the city is always on top. But I want to tell you why I have kept the term. It has a lot of limitations, and most of what I'm going to talk about today is actually how the definitions of bilingualism that we have been working with do not fit, right? So it has a lot of limitations. But for me, who's old, it has a link to the past. It has a link to the civil rights struggles. It has a link to the communities, mostly Chicano and Puerto Rican communities who struggled for a more equitable education for their children. So to me, the word bilingual means something. And that's why when people ask me, why don't you give it up? You always talk against it. I say, well, because it means something to me, right? And I think it sort of links us to that struggle that we have all encountered. And it's interesting, Silvia, that 40 years afterwards, 50 years afterwards, almost in terms of my work, we're still struggling with the same politics, right? How difficult it is to open up spaces that really fit all of us. So that's why I don't give it up, because of the sense of struggle y lucha que la palabra bilingüe connotes for me, because I lived that history, okay? Pero para empezar, the only way that we understand all of us is by looking closely. And we always start with theories and terms and things. And I want to start somewhere else, because I think if we start with the children, we understand a lot of what we don't understand if we talk about things in an abstract way. So what I'm going to do with you today is to walk you through 3 cases about a boy named Paco, who's 6 years old, una niña que se llama Julia, que acaba de llegar, tiene 10 años y acaba de llegar de Honduras, and Altagracia, who's 17, and is in a community college. And she's been in New York. These are all New York students, of course, for 2 years. And by the way, these are students that I've written about. So they're close to me, both because I've lived them and also because I have thought about them a lot. Empezamos con Paco, que tiene 6 años. And Paco was born in the United States. Su mamá es latina, nacida en los Estados Unidos. Su papá es gringo, and he studied Spanish in high school, so he speaks some Spanish. He's the oldest of 2 children. He has a Spanish-speaking babysitter who's from Ecuador, and his mother insisted that this was a job for someone that did not speak English, right? Because they wanted the child to really develop some bilingualism. So in the family, there are these bilingual practices, right, which are very common for all of us. People don't understand them, pero es la norma, es la manera que nosotros nos comunicamos siempre. But he goes to school to an English mainstream classroom. And this is the journal that he wrote in 1st grade, one of his journals. And this is what we're going to focus on. ¿Y quién quiere leerlo? ¿Quién quiere leerlo? A ver, esta es Fran... Jofren. Jofren.
Me at noche buena for a sleep over at abuela and abuelo's house.
Exactly. Me at Nochebuena for a sleepover at abuelo and abuela's house. And you can see that this is a New York City building, right? With a Christmas tree that doesn't quite look like a Christmas tree, but you get the idea. So this is Paco's first grade teacher's reaction to this journal. So she asks herself these questions. So what is going on with this kid? Is he an English language learner? Is he a native speaker? What is his first language? What is his second language? Why is he using Spanish words? Is he mixing? Is he code switching? Now, what is interesting about this teacher is that this is a teacher who actually has a master's degree and actually has taken a course in ESL. And these are all terms that she has learned in the class, right? In the teacher education class, right? So I'm telling you this because if we don't start with looking at our communities and our kids, we're lost. If we just read what people write about us, we're lost. We have to start with looking closely at what people are doing with language, at what children are doing with language. So even though she is, enlightened in some way, she really has it completely wrong because she has learned to think this way because this is a norm. This is the way we've been taught to think about language, right? And of course, what she concludes is, well, this kid needs some remediation. He's limited in some ways, right? So what I want you to do now, is to talk to the person next to you and answer these questions, right? Let's see, what do you think? You're not the teacher. I think you're more enlightened than the teacher, right? So what do you think? Why is he using Nochebuena and abuelo and abuelas? And what about all these concepts? Do they make sense? How is he communicating? Is he mixing? So let me give you 2 minutes to talk to the person next to you, and then you're going to come back to me. Okay. I hope you've had some chance to think about these questions. And now I want to know, Alejandro has a microphone. I want to know who has something to share with the whole group. Okay. Alejandro, por aquí. Ah, allá hay otra. Okay, sorry. Pam, is it Pam?
Okay. Hi, I'm Jimena Franco Jenkins. The first thing that came to mind was, the fact that Nochebuena is such a cultural thing. It's not about Christmas Eve. And abuelo and abuela, it's kind of like your relationships, your emotions, at least for me. When I write in Spanish, it's everything related to my emotions and what's meaningful for me. that I bring in, and those usually tend to be the words that I write in Spanish.
Good. Okay, great. A ver, Alejandro's.
We were here talking, and one of the things that we were saying is that even though he uses Nochebuena, abuelo, and abuela, that is not that he is changing their name into another language. That is who he called. That is their name. Nochebuena is the name of that actual holiday. So it's not that he's mixing; it's that he's calling it by its name.
Good. Okay, great. One more, maybe. Yes. I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
No, it's Cassie.
Kathy.
I think that he is using the other language, the Spanish one, because I think he's like a beginner now. If you are a beginner, so your native language is always controlling all your thinking. So when I trying to speak or try to do something or write something, your native language always like controlling your thinking first. So you are mixing between two languages now when you are trying to express about something or write about something. Like my daughter, when our language is Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So when she's trying to think about something, the Arabic one is like controlling her reaction first, everything, and then she's trying like to, no, it's not correct. Then she start Arabic first and then mix between Arabic and English.
But do
know
you
what I
agree
mean?
with her that actually Nochebuena is what this child wants to speak? I mean, it's not that he's mixing anything. It's just that this is the name of the event. This is culturally, and I'm sure your daughter does the same thing, right? So thank you so much. One more, maybe. Okay, one more, because we I mean, we can go on through this forever. Yeah.
We felt it was a great example of first grade writing, if not advanced. Uses capital letters at the start of a sentence, uses punctuation, and that, again, we agree with using the appropriate terms for the appropriate events. My kids call my grandparents Nana and Papa, so if you were to switch that out, he would have written Nana and Papa instead of Abuela and Abuelo.
Right.
So it's using the appropriate terms for the appropriate people.
I wonder if we can stop the discussion here so we can get to the second and third, because I think it's good that you came on a Friday night, but I'm sure you also want to go home afterwards, right? But I can see that this really is something that's resonating with us. But I'll tell you what I know about this kid, right? What I know about this kid is that his father, remember I told you he was gringo and he learned Spanish in high school, but is from an Italian-American family. And I don't know what you do here in North Carolina, but at least Italian-Americans in New York City, for Christmas Eve, they eat 7 fishes. That's a meal of 7 fishes, right? So for this child, Christmas Eve is not the same thing as Nochebuena. Nochebuena is where there's music, and there's arroz con frijoles negros, y puerco, y yuca. That's Nochebuena, music and dancing and all of that. So it's not the same thing. Like you said, it is the name of something different, right? And the same thing with abuelo and abuela. His grandpa and grandma speak English only. They're different from his abuelo and abuela, who are different people, right? So one of the things we have to remember is that what this child is doing is using all his resources. It's not that he's mixing. He's not mixing, right? It's just that he wants to express his whole self, which he cannot do if he did it in English only. In English only, he would be leaving parts of his self behind. He would be leaving behind what he does in Nochebuena. He would be leaving behind abuelo and abuela. So he's using all his resources to communicate. He's not leaving himself behind. He's not mixing, right? We have this tendency to think whenever we see this, that people are mixing. People are using that word that Sylvia has trouble with, el repertorio, right? Their repertoire, their full repertoire, the full linguistic repertoire. Notice how also this journal, has a drawing, right? Because we allow in first grade still, we allow kids to express themselves with language that is multimodal, so that it includes writing, but it also can include drawing. And as they get older and older, we restrict that possibility of using language in these other ways, right? So that's Paco, all right? Hold on to Paco while we discuss. Oh, so this is what we have all thought about. That at 6 years of age, Paco actually knows more than his teacher, right? What does he know? He knows that there are different worlds, and in these different worlds, we all have different concepts. And for these different concepts and the different worlds in which we live, we need different words, right? It's not that we're mixing, it's that we're expressing all of us. Nochebuena is not the same as Christmas Eve. Abuelo and abuela is not the same as grandma and grandpa. He's using his full repertorio to signify without excluding his own life, right? And this repertorio includes the sounds, the words, the visuals, the senses, the affective, the sensorial, the historical, the histories that we all have, our lives, our histories, right? And he's expressing all of it. And his languaging cannot be classified. Can't be that we know what is his first language and what is the second language. Those terms do not make any sense, all right? They were coined before there was acknowledgement of bilingual lives, right? When the thinking was that you were monolingual and you acquired a second language or you learned a second language sequentially. The truth is that most bilingual children in the United States today are simultaneous bilinguals. They're growing up in homes in which more than one language is spoken, like your daughter picking up Arabic, right? So that is a simultaneous bilingualism that does not allow this definition that we have been taught, that people have a first language and a second language, right? Think of the criteria. I can think that my first language chronologically was Spanish. I learned Spanish first and English second. But is English or Spanish, is Spanish my first language in terms of the way that I use it, in terms of my academic life, in terms of my personal life? Is it the way that people identify me with? Is it what I identify myself with? All those criteria will lead to different categories. We would say that it's first or second, depending, right? Depending. So these are names, these are terms that were coined in the literature before we started thinking and before we started letting in bilingual lives into the academy, right? And I think it's very important for us to remember that just because it is in a book, it doesn't exist in a person or in a community, right? You have to start with the people in the community first and then put it in the book, not the other way around, which is the way in which we keep on doing it because we want to shape our world and shape our lives in certain ways and continue to oppress certain people and continue to alienate certain people. And language is, like other categories, a way of doing it, right? So we have to remember all of that. Heritage is the other term that we all talk about. I'm never sure what heritage language means, right? Because it means to me, it's sort of, heritage is sort of old, but also because in some ways it takes away the privilege of being a native speaker of Spanish or Arabic or whatever other language you speak here in the United States, right? My grandchildren, my children, are not heritage speakers of Spanish. They speak Spanish alongside English, right? So it's the problem with heritage, and don't ask me what we should call it because I have no idea, right? But the question always is keep questioning the terms, right? Because the terms don't always fit the persons, right? Okay. And he's really not mixing. Or code switching, which is a word, again, a technical word that they have taught us to say, right? By the way, my own work in the beginning was full of all of this, because that's what we do. We go to graduate school, we learn, we pick up these terms, we use them, right? And then little by little you say, but this doesn't make sense for me or my community. And then you start fighting it, I think. And I think the advantage of young scholars is that you are stepping into a world that has started to question these things. And I think you're going to start from a different point. And I think you're going to be able to advance this in ways that my generation was not able to. So he's not code switching. There's nothing here about he's switching two languages. He's certainly simply using his whole repertoire, his whole repertorio, right? Creatively and critically, because he doesn't want to leave any part of his own self behind, and creatively, because this is very creative. So the teacher missed the point completely, okay? So I just want to remind you that from an internal perspective, he's just using his full unitary repertoire. Creatively, critically, not to omit his experience. Of course, the school's external perspective, he's mixing, he's code switching, and I want to remind you that it's a school then that creates la deficiencia, right? The child is not deficient in any way. It's the school's way of using language and thinking about language that then creates the deficiency, okay? And so the question for all of us who do bilingual education also, and I know many of you are here, are in the, is it the North Carolina or the Carolina Association of Bilingual Education? The question is, all right, so does just doing bilingual education, does that solve the problem? And so I want to tell you, poor Paco goes to 3rd grade, and they're able to move to a district that has a dual language bilingual program. And they put him in this program. And now all of a sudden, there is Miss Stewart, who's the English teacher, and only sees him for English. And she says he's deficient, puts him in the lowest reading level, gives him a remedial curriculum, because she says, el problema es el español. And then there's poor la señora Medina, que es colombiana, no como esta señora, sino mucho más mejor. Y la señora Medina went to high school and college in Colombia. She knows a lot, but she has not had a bilingual experience herself. She hasn't understood what bilingual development is all about. And therefore, she also says que tiene deficiencia, que tiene interferencias del inglés, and his problem is his English. So again, the consequence of this division, of this setup that we have established, again, by thinking that all of us are two monolinguals in one, where we know that none of us can be two monolinguals in one. Because to be two monolinguals in one would mean that we would be leaving out, when we speak English, una experiencia, and when we speak Spanish, the other experiencia. And what we do is we integrate our whole beings when we speak, right? So it's this deficiencia that is caused by this vision of this. And I'm sure you have heard a lot teachers who tell you, es que mis niños, estos niños aquí en esta clase bilingüe, todos son nilingües. You've heard it, right? Because I've heard it a lot, right? Among teachers who should be thinking critically about bilingualism, right? And therefore they need the remediation. So basically what's happening is that these bilingual children's practices really cannot fit monolingual educational spaces, even if those spaces are bilingual or dual. If you are building a bilingual, a dual language bilingual program that again separates in these ways, they cannot do it. It cannot fit. There's something that we have to change. Okay, so let me take you to the second example. This is a different example. This is Julia. Julia was born as Garifuna. I don't know if you know who Garifunas are, but they're people of Amerindian and African descendancy came from St. Vincent Islands, and they were exiled and went to Belize and Honduras. So she's Garifuna, and she was born in Puerto Cortes, Honduras. She lived with her grandmother because her mother left for New York when she was a baby. She lived with her grandmother, idyllic childhood. They went fishing, they were by the sea. Grandmother used to fish. Really wonderful childhood. She spoke Garifuna and Spanish. But the school was, like in all our countries that have been colonized in many, many ways, right? The school was all in Spanish. But it turns out that Julia was a precocious child, and she won all kinds of awards, premios por declamación de poesía. I'm sure that some of you who are Latin Americans know this tradition of declaiming classical poetry. Well, she won every award that there could be. She was really good at reciting classical Spanish poetry. And she was also good with punta music, which is traditional Garifuna music. And she also played the drums, and she would compose, actually, lyrics for the Garifuna music that she played. In February 2020, I want you to notice, right before the pandemic and after Biden came into power, she crossed the border to meet her mother in New York. I will spare you that story of how she crossed the border and what happened, but to make a long story short, she entered an ESL program in New York City. And of course, the pandemic came later. But the first week of that class in ESL, the teacher was just teaching an ESL lesson in what the teacher thought were just comparatives. So what was the teacher doing? The teacher was teaching the kids how to say as tall as short as smart as, and she gets to as pretty as. When she gets to as pretty as, Julia internally translates it to tan bonita como, right? And she knows a poem, which I'm sure some of you know, by Rubén Darío, called Margarita. And this poem is a beautiful poem. If you don't know it, look it up. And Margarita, this was a poem that the grandmother always used to recite to her. And she would always pat her in her cheek. These are things that Julia told me afterwards, many months afterwards, right? So all of a sudden, she's listening to As Pretty As, and she thinks of Tan Bonita Como, y le viene a la mente Tan bonita Margarita, tan bonita como tú, which is one of the verses of the poem. And then another verse of the poem says, guarda niña un gentil pensamiento al que un día te quiso contar un cuento. So think of someone that one day wanted to tell you a story. And of course, she starts thinking of her grandmother. And she starts sobbing uncontrollably. She doesn't know. The teacher, of course, is astounded, doesn't know what's happening with Julia. The kids are completely bamboozled. They don't understand what's happening. Y entonces, la maestra pregunta a uno de los niños que habla español, what's she crying about? And the girl asks her, ¿por qué está llorando? And she says, Rubén Darío. But of course, this kid doesn't know about Rubén Darío. So what she tells the teacher is, well, something about a Rubén. That's what she says, something about a Rubén. And the teacher all of a sudden ignores the sobbing completely, right? So this is another case. So what I want you to do now is to think a little bit together, again, like you did before, of what is it that Julia knows that the teacher doesn't know, and how is Julia making connections to her past, and what's the teacher missing, okay? Let's do it again, 2 minutes. No, that's okay. Yo, no, sí, sí. Gracias. You don't have a partner. ¿Qué pasa?
No, que estamos hablando cómo esta niña tiene un background knowledge tan grande que su docente no puede ver justamente por la asociación que ella llegó a hacer, desde una pequeña frase gramatical a toda su historia de vida.
¿Nos lo vas a compartir ahora?
Sí.
Ok, perfecto. Yo
Usted
te...
sabe de que yo soy argentina,
Ajá.
en el borde con Paraguay. Los chicos hablan guaraní. En mi ciudad hablan español, pero algunos vienen de un pueblo a tener clases y hablan guaraní. Y yo tuve alumnos
Sí.
que cuando hacían sus producciones en inglés, en vez de poner inglés y español, ponían inglés guaraní.
Qué interesante.
Sí, yo hice
Muy
un estudio
interesante.
lingüístico.
Muy interesante. Yo trabajé un poquito en la frontera de Uruguay con Brasil.
Ah, sí, portuñol.
Sí, sí, que era fascinante, porque en el parque no había problema, pero en las escuelas siempre había problema. Okay, all right, so we have microphones. Who wants to start? Oh, here's someone.
Hello, good evening. I am Alejandra. I'm from Argentina, and we were talking about this case of Julia, and we realized that her background knowledge is so rich that her teacher couldn't understand what's going on. That is.
Okay, okay. Who else? Ah, Julia's more difficult, yeah.
Thank you. So I just wanted to thank you first and then say I want to cry every time that these situations come up, seriously. I mean, it just like makes me so sad. And thank you for bringing it to our attention. So Julia knows poetry. The teacher doesn't, probably.
Say it again?
Poetry.
Yeah.
That's like, you know, her world,
Her
basically.
expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose the teacher is so stressed out by the rhythm of the school system that she cannot pause to empathize with whatever is going on. I don't think that the teacher means anything like, it's not ill-intended,
Right.
but it's just difficult for her to pause and empathize.
Right.
And this traffic is going like in a highway while it needs to stop.
Yeah, well said. Yes. I know that she had her hand up, so and you want to say something too? Okay.
I think something noticeable here is that the teacher is not able or doesn't recognize for some reason that the student, Julia, is actually directly applying the content of the lesson. It reflects a deep understanding of this grammar construct that she was able to make that linguistic association. Mm-hmm. And because the teacher doesn't have the full context, she isn't able to see how much her student really knows. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's important as well that the other students don't have the same cultural connection or context. Mm-hmm. Although students might speak the same language,
Yes,
that does not
absolutely.
mean that they have the same cultural context and understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah, good. Yeah. Good points, all of you. One more.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kim, and we were talking about the teacher is missing that background information about the student, the connections, building relationships. Of course, we don't know how long it was before they started teaching this lesson, how long Julia had been in the school. But, you know, the first thing when we meet our ELs or MLs, however we want to call them, you know, just finding out some background information. Where do you come from? What languages, you know, are you speaking with your family, with your friends, and music and poetry and things, you know, things of that nature that are very important. And, you know, as a former EL teacher, sometimes, yes, we just get a piece of paper. This is the student, this is the language, just teach them.
Right.
You know, and to know that she had such a full linguistic repertoire in Garifuna and Spanish, and now being able to make those connections, and you said it very eloquently, you know, you know, and so we were discussing the teacher is missing that, and missing the empathy, just ignoring the fact that she's sobbing and not trying to console the child or make that connection with the child even in a moment of noticeably being sorrowful.
Yeah. Thank you. These were all very important points, right? And I want you to know that this teacher had no idea what Garifuna was, right? To talk about what she had no idea. I mean, I had to sit down with her afterwards. And she just saw Julia. She was a black student who spoke Spanish, never questioned about Garifuna or anything else. So, and it's a great point that you can speak the same language and yet not have the same cultural baggage, right? And the other point of where have we left emotions and feelings in teaching? Where are they, you know? And how much of what we learn is because it touches us, right? Not because it's here, but because it's here, right? So yes, we're all stressed with the pacing calendars. I think they've gotten a little bit better since the pandemic. Have they here in North Carolina? I think in New York I see that, not yet? Yeah, but less we're doing other things, but I think the pacing calendars are a little bit under control now. I think we learned something during the pandemic. I think some teachers learned something. I know that in New York City, one of the things that was most outstanding to me was the fact that some teachers saw for the very first time the fact that parents in the home who were speaking in Arabic or Urdu or Spanish or whatever, Haitian Creole, were actually teaching their children English. And somehow that experience of seeing it opened up a whole set of ideas that they were close to. So, you know, some things we gained, some things we lost, but some things we gained. So, yeah, the teacher is missing a lot of what teaching is about. Teaching has to be about relationships, and if it's not about relationships, the structures that you teach make absolutely no sense. So I think that what we've been saying is that Julia knows what su maestra and others do not know, and she's again drawing her on her full repertoire inwardly. A lot of what we do when we learn is inward. It's not seen. It's not in the surface. And we keep missing it because it's not in the surface. And we have to recognize that it's not in the surface. And this concept that I think Latin American decolonial scholars talk about all the time, which I think in some cultures, like the one that we live in, we forget. That it's all about this sentipensar, that you can't think without also feeling, that there's this feeling, thinking going on, and that we think, feel with our bodies too, right? Not just our minds, right? Okay, so this is the last one, and now I have to find out how long I have, because I've lost track of time, but Maria will tell me. Okay? Okay, Maria says we're good. Okay, so this is Altagracia. Altagracia is 17 years old. She's Dominican. She came from the Dominican Republic 2 years ago. She went to a community college. This is her first year there. And she's taking history. She's very interested in history. But of course, a history textbook is written in a college-level academic English. And this day, they're doing a lesson on Columbus and Columbus' encounter with the Taínos. And Altagracia thinks she has some Taino blood somehow, so she's very interested in this. And for homework, the teacher, who's more enlightened than Paco's teacher and that Julia's teacher, allows them to use all their resources and makes sure that when they do homework, they can talk to their parents, ask questions, use other languages, use the internet, etc. So she sends them with this assignment, and what Altagracia does is she goes home, she opens up the internet, and she starts reading articles in Spanish about the encounter, right? Columbus encounter. And she watches videos. The videos she can watch in English, but she read 2 or 3 articles in Spanish, and she happens to come across an article that says that the encounter was not an encounter, but it was an invasion of the Arawak-speaking people in the Caribbean. And she's really interested in this idea. What do you mean? It wasn't just an encounter, it was an invasion, right? And so she starts thinking about it. She goes to school, and the next day, the teacher puts them in guided reading groups to discuss the reading that they are doing, right? And the guided reading group in which Altagracia gets put in has 2 other bilingual Dominican students, has 2 African-American students, and 1 Polish student. Very common in New York, right? No, nowhere is there a classroom that does not have multilingual children. Nowhere. It doesn't exist. Okay. So this is some of the dialogue that goes on afterwards in this little group. Altagracia says, it wasn't an encounter. Fue una invasión del Spanish Empire, como la de the United States en la República Dominicana. And then one of the Dominican students says, what invasión? She doesn't understand what she's saying. And then Altagracia explains in Spanish to this other Dominican student in the small group, all right, that in 1965 there was a military coup that deposed the democratically elected president, Juan Bosch, because of his pro-Castro Cuban sentiments. And she, of course, then, just to make sure that everybody knows that this is right, me lo dijo mi tía, right? My aunt told me, this really makes it right. And at this point, the African-American student, one of the African-American students, doesn't know what's going on. And he says, what? And the Dominican student then explains in English what Altagracia has said. And this African-American student says, what is the Spanish Empire? And Altagracia then takes out and shows a map of Spain and all the territories. And this African-American student says, what? That little thing conquered that big thing? I mean, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. And the Polish student asks Altagracia, are you Taíno? And Altagracia says, yes y no. Yo estoy mezclada, but my mother always called me India, so probablemente sí. And the Dominican student then goes and says, wait, 1492 is not the same as 1965, and I don't think we can call it an invasion. And Altagracia then shows them an archival video on the American invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. And the Dominican student says, but wait, Americans never burned alive any Dominicans. And Altagracia says, verdad, but there were tanques, ships, rifles, Marines, people died. And as often happens, the bell rings. But the bell rings, and this group really erupts. They don't want to finish. They keep, there are all kinds of groans and quejas, and they want to keep on talking. So in this interest of time, we're going to do our notice things together, right? So what do we notice? We notice that the students are very engaged and interested. We notice that Altagracia is no longer limited, right? She's actually the leader. She's the one that's thinking. We notice that everybody's critical consciousness is raised. What do you mean there was an invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965? And what about the Spanish Empire? What happened? How could this little thing conquer that big territory, right? And then we notice that English is no longer the focus. It's not what the lesson is about, the content is. And we notice also, and this is important, that Altagracia's language is perfectly academic. We have this tendency to think that this way of speaking is not academic. There's nothing more academic than what Altagracia is teaching these students, actually. But yet we think that because it sounds like that, it is not academic. And I want you to, every time I go into a classroom and the teachers tell me, problem here is that they don't have academic language, I have to say, well, what is academic language? And then no one knows, right? Because what we do with our language, if we use it right, is always academic, right? There's no such thing. But I also want you to notice that in this case, it actually was the teacher's practices that enabled this engagement and this way of looking at Altagracia's language, not as limited, but as academic, right? Because the teacher actually made sure that the students also consulted their familia and that was important. La tía, lo que decía la tía era importante. She also facilitated these groupings so that they could really talk to each other and not be afraid to think out of the box. And she also encouraged them to use the bilingual practices from the home. So just then, so we can advance a little bit before Maria throws us out of here, I want you to think of what is it that Paco and Julia and Altagracia are doing. From their own bilingual perspective, they are what we're calling translanguaging, right? I want you to notice that their bilingualism is not additive. There's not a box that's being added to another box. It's completely dynamic. It adjusts to whatever circumstance is happening. There's nothing lacking, but they're using language creatively and critically. They're not code switching. They're using their own full unitary repertoire. They don't have a first, second, etc. language. They do language with a unitary repertoire that is their own, that communicates who we are, and each of us have a different repertoire because we have different histories, different experiences, right? And they're not conforming in any way to monolingual, monoglossic ideologies that languages have to be separated and that languages are normed by the nation states as a way to control some of us, right? So they're just disrupting what we're calling the colonial logic of language. And just to make sure we all understand what does the colonial logic, what is the colonial logic? Well, there are these categories of inferiority that were invented and imposed during the encounter, right? And there are categories of race, categories of gender, and categories of language that enabled us to make differences between the Europeans who came and the people who were here, right? And these were categories that then created deficiencies so that some people worked and other people did not, right? And I want to remind you that what Aníbal Quijano, who's a Peruvian sociologist, has called coloniality, exists today, continues today, right? After the what do you call it? The colonists left after the encounter and all of that. These categories have persisted, and they're categories of control. They're categories that create deficiencies. And that is why the category of language is a category that we all have to be critical of and also own it in some ways so that we know that it is not the norm that has been imposed by nation states and schools, which are the agents of nation states, but that language is much more. It's a human system of communication that enables all of us to participate if it was done with ways that did not contain certain practices. So what is translanguaging? It's an alternative way of thinking about language and bilingualism that goes against the colonial logic of language. And what do we think about it? We think about it as what speakers do. Language is not something we have. That's why, in a way, we're never, ever finished learning language. If we were, we wouldn't have to take English classes in college when we finish or whatever, right? We're always learning. We're always emergent, right? We're always emergent bilinguals because there are some experiences that we haven't yet had, or maybe we'll never have them. So therefore, we don't have the language to think about those experiences, to language those experiences different. So speakers do language, they engage in languaging, by assembling, and I'm talking assembling, putting together all our features. There are lived ethnographies, our histories, our emotions, our funds of knowledge, our bodies, our senses, all relevant objects into our own unitary repertoire. I want to say that that is something that we all do. All speakers do that. Problem is that for some speakers, bilinguals, another language minoritized speakers, they do the same thing. They assemble all the resources, except the ways in which they assemble them are not considered valid, right? So I want you to understand this, that this is not something that some people do and some people don't. All of us do this, right? It's just that some of the features, some of the resources that we put together, some of the experience some of us have had are not considered valid. And therefore, it ends up being not valid, right? But there's nothing not valid about it because it works as a system of communication. It's just that it's not valid because some people have said that it's not valid, right? So in terms of how do we do this in school, what does this mean for pedagogical practices? I think we have gone from this monolingual and also traditional bilingual pedagogies where we try to fit the round bilingual practice into one or two square monolingual instructional spaces to this more flexible space that all of you now thank to Maria Cody, own this book, right, of the translanguaging classroom, which provides flexible translanguaging spaces to free language minoritized speakers to use their full repertoire. And I want to emphasize translanguaging spaces, because I'm not saying disrupt everything, right? Because after all, we have to extend some features of language, because all of us want our children to speak in ways that are acceptable at times, right? Not at other times, because we want our children, I want my grandchildren to speak Spanish, right? So that may not be acceptable to some people, but it's acceptable to me, right? So, but we do have to have these spaces that where we are allowed to be ourselves, languaging, along with instructional spaces maybe that are in one language or the other, right? So, I want to remind you that these are not strategies. And, you know, I stop here because lots of people want strategies. What do? I want you to think. I want you to think that what we're doing is just opening up these spaces in which bilingual students are free to engage in translanguaging, to bring all of themselves into their instruction, to learn, to live, and be, right? So it's how do you open up these spaces so that we're all free to be ourselves and not someone else. In your book, you will find that we talk about 3 strands of translanguaging pedagogy: a stance, a design, and a shift. For the stance, what we want everyone to remember is that bilingual students are not categories. I know we have categories, and maybe that's the only way to do school, right? But I want you to remember that these categories are completely arbitrary. I mean, someone decided at this point they're this, and at this point they're that, right? They're completely arbitrary. And that we're all the time in emergence. Emergence meaning that this is always happening. We're always doing. It's a continuous network of ways of doing language. And the bilingualism is dynamic, it's not simply additive, it's not simply about adding a second box, an L2 to an L1, but it's more like adding pearls to a string of pearls, right? Adding more features so that you can extend the repertoire, right? So that you can extend the pearls and then use the pearls that are adequate for, I don't need this, I don't know why I'm holding it. I don't know. So use the pearls that are adequate for whatever situation you're in, right? Okay, so the translanguaging shifts are very easy. You have to be a co-learner. You have to make sure that when you walk into your classroom, you're excited about learning who your students are. Your students are going to be different. You want to be able to know what their practices are. You're going to have to be able to be a co-learner, not just their teacher. And I use this image of the corriente, of a river current, because it helps me remember that maybe there are two sides, right? On the, again, on the en la superficie, right? There are two sides. I was just in Laredo recently, so it was very easy for me to tell them, well, look, on this side of the river, it's Mexico, on this side of the river is the United States. But people really live in the middle, right? In that current that does not have sides, right? Because when you're in the back abajo, lo hondo, it's not one side or the other, right? It's a blend of both, right? So that's what the translanguaging corriente is like. And we have to follow the kids' translanguaging corriente. And as you know, all of you who teach know that you're teaching one thing, like poor Julia's teacher who was teaching comparatives, and Julia was with Rubén Darío, right? And so we're always, kids are always doing that, right? And you have to sort of think of what is going on, not on the surface, but deep within them. And then the translanguaging designs are not strategies, again, but opening up translanguaging spaces. And I want you to remember where do you open up translanguaging spaces? Everywhere. It doesn't have to be one model or the other. It can be mainstream English, it can be ESL, it can be bilingual of all kinds, right? But why? You have to open up translanguaging spaces for equity's sake, because you want to give validity and space to other lives and practices. You want to protect the ways of doing language, but not isolate them from the student's life. And you want to recognize that in all classrooms, in dual language, bilingual classrooms, and I know this is part of your work, right? There are children who are recognized as Spanish speakers who have other languages, right? In New York City, lots of Mixteco, lots of Quechua lately, right? Incredible richness of languages. And then we're working with two languages when it doesn't all reflect the lives of the children. So thinking always that it has to be beyond two, right? Because it has to be with the practices. So when do you open up spaces? You have, I think the first two you all recognize. When you have a newcomer in your classroom, you use it to scaffold. This is easy. Any intelligent teacher knows that they have to do that, because otherwise, what's the sense of teaching and the students are not understanding? So they use ways of translanguaging because they want to make sure that students understand. Also, to assess or document what they know. For example, Julia knew a lot about fishing, but she couldn't express it. And it is different to think about what is it that a child knows and can do from what is it that the child knows and can do in English or in Arabic or in Spanish, right? That's different. So sometimes the teacher opens up the translanguaging space to make sure that you're assessing appropriately. And then the next three are things that we sometimes ignore. To acknowledge and make visible lives and languaging entre mundos. So many of our children live entre mundos in bilingual homes, right? And yet we never give them a chance to voice their other self, right? At school, they hide their other self, right? To deepen understandings. The students with Altagracia were deepening understandings about the encounter and about the Spanish Empire that they had never, ever, ever thought about. And to transform the critical consciousness of all, I bet you that those students in Altagracia's class will never think about Columbus in the same way. And we're coming up on Monday, right? So an invasion of the Arawak-speaking people, right? So it changes the questions. Think about Paco and the questions that the teacher asked about him. And she asked questions about what is his language, and is he an English language learner, and what is his dominant language? Those are questions that she had, because she started there. But look what happened after they opened up this translanguaging space, the questions changed. And that's what I find most exciting about opening up translanguaging classrooms, that the questions that they ask of the kids change. They ask about what is their engagement, what are they curious about, what is their interest, what are the connections to other people and other ideas, and can they find key ideas and make inferences and associate ideas from multiple texts. I used to call it the weave before Trump started with the weave, but anyway, but it's the idea that we no longer focus on one language or the other, but we focus on language, on our ability to make sense of the world in ways that express ourselves. So just to finish, because I'm hoping it's time for some questions maybe, maybe not. I think the big why is what I want to leave you with for the future, right? Because I do think that we have made tremendous strides in the last 40 years, tremendous strides, and there are more of us here than ever. But there has to be a better future for Paco, for Julia, for Altagracia, y los millones como ellos, y todos nosotros, ¿no? Y los Estados Unidos. Y yo creo que sí se puede. Y se tiene que hacer sin miedo, and that's the subtitle of the book that we edited, Maite Sanchez and I, last year, because there is some fear about saying these things. And if I can give you some knowledge of an old person, I was always afraid to say, this is not what I'm seeing in classrooms. This is not what I see in my community. This is not what I'm seeing in my family, because someone was telling me something completely different. And it wasn't until I started describing from the ground up what was I seeing that it gave me the courage to say it sin miedo. And that's what I hope for all of you. That's what I wish all of you, that you do it sin miedo. Y muchas gracias por la invitación. Muchas gracias. Ay, Dios mío. Si no, déjenme decirle, si no fuera por ustedes, tampoco estaría yo aquí. So, I mean, we help each other. Everything is a collaboration. I pull you, you pull me, and we pull each other, and we pull the kids with us. So, gracias, because this gives me energy to continue to do a little bit of work, because I've done it.
Ofelia, muchísimas gracias. We have a little NC State thank you. There's some little thank yous for you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Gracias,
much.
gracias, Maria. Oh my God.
Right on
Thank
there.
you.
So
Gracias.
So It's 6 o'clock now. I just want to say thank you to everybody, but I wondered if there's one or two burning questions.
Oh, okay.
If one or two burning questions. But I also want to make space available if it's okay. I think, Ofelia, says quite a few people here that would love for you to sign their book. And I think I
I'd be
know
happy
people
to.
that have brought even some of your other books.
La montaña de libros.
So maybe what we'll do is 6 o'clock and it's Friday night. So maybe we could kind of move on out into the reception area and maybe sign a few books. And please help yourself to food and drinks and we'll have an open space
Thank
there.
you.
How's that?
Thank you, Maria.
Okay, that's it. Thank you
Perfecto.
so much. Thank you for coming.